The first thing I noticed was the heat, not the ordinary heat of a summer day in Marseille or a bakery oven. It was a heat that embraced you like a living substance, pressing into every inch of your skin and burning to the bone, a heat so intense it made it impossible to think of anything other than the pain. My name is Pierre Dubo, and I was the family chef at one of Lyon's most prestigious restaurants for almost 2 decades. I held a position of trust, not only selecting the wines that would accompany the Michelin-starred chef's creations, but also managing a wine cellar valued at millions of euros. I never thought I would one day be telling this story, less a story that begins with an accident on Autoroute 6 and ends with a revelation about eternity that forever changed my perspective on life, death, and the purpose of existence. On that fateful Thursday night, I was returning home after a meeting with a wine producer from the Burgundy region. We had spent the entire day tasting exceptional vintages, negotiating the acquisition of some rare bottles for the restaurant. It was a part of my job that I particularly enjoyed, less the contact with passionate producers, the discovery of unique wines, the feeling of creating something special for our customers, but it was also a responsibility that, over time, I began to abuse. The rain was falling heavily that night, and visibility was almost nil. The windshield wipers barely managed to clear the accumulating water. I remember thinking about calling my wife, Amélie, to let her know I'd be home a little late. I'd promised I'd be home in time for dinner together, something I'd been neglecting for weeks due to the demands of work, or at least that was the excuse I gave. I decided to pick up the speed a bit, despite the dangerous conditions. That's when I lost control of the vehicle on a curve. The car spun several times, like a bottle of wine being spun to assess its color and viscosity. I had a brief moment of clarity where I thought, so this is how it ends. Before crashing violently into the safety barrier. After that, only darkness. What happened next was neither a dream nor a hallucination. It was so real and vivid that the memories remained intact in my mind, as if seared with a hot iron. I realized I was floating above the scene of the accident. I saw my body motionless in the driver's seat, my head slightly tilted, as if asleep. A trickle of blood was running from my temple. I saw the headlights of other cars that had stopped, people hurriedly getting out, someone calling an ambulance on their cell phone, a woman standing next to the car and checking my pulse. The expression on her face told me everything. There was no heartbeat. It was strangely peaceful to watch it all from the outside, like a spectator watching a movie about his own death. I felt neither pain nor fear, only a distant curiosity and a slight sadness at the thought of Amélie and our children, and then I began to descend, not toward the wet asphalt of the road, but toward the depths. It was a slow fall at first, as if floating gently on a current of warm air. I watched the scene of the accident, growing ever more distant, the lights of the vehicles looking like tiny stars until they disappeared completely. Darkness began to envelop me, but gradually the speed increased. The darkness became denser, more palpable. I could feel it against my skin like a viscous substance that hampered every movement. It was like swimming in a thick, dark wine, but without the sweetness or pleasure, only increasing resistance and oppression. The air, if it could be called air, grew heavier, thicker, with each passing second. Breathing required a conscious and painful effort. Each breath was like inhaling acid. It burned my lungs, my throat, my nostrils. The sensation was reminiscent of tasting an extremely tannic and astringent wine, but multiplied by 1,000 and applied not only to the mouth, but to the entire respiratory system. I tried to scream, but I couldn't. The sound remained trapped inside me, bouncing off the walls of my soul. That's when I realized I was no longer in my physical body. What was descending was not my flesh and blood, but my essence, my consciousness. My soul, however, could feel pain, a pain that transcended the limits of the physical, a pain that reached the very core of my being. It was as if every sin, every small betrayal, every lie I had told throughout my life had transformed into a red-hot needle that now pierced my soul. The fall continued for what seemed interminable. There was no way to measure how long I had been falling. It could have been minutes or centuries. The notion of temporality had completely disappeared. In the world of wine, We talk about how certain vintages transcend time, how certain aromas evoke distant memories, but this was different. It was a complete dissolution of time as we know it, replaced by an eternal moment of descent and suffocation. Then, I finally felt I was arriving somewhere. The absolute darkness gave way to a reddish twilight, a faint, sickly glow, that didn't exactly illuminate the room, but only made it vaguely visible. It was like the glow you see when you look at a glass of red wine against candlelight, minus a deep, almost opaque red that suggests more than it reveals. The ground beneath my feet was rough, uneven, composed of jagged rocks that cut like shards of glass. Each step was torture, like walking barefoot over broken corks and bottle splinters. I looked around and saw that I was in an enormous tunnel, so vast that its walls were lost in the darkness. The ceiling was too high to be seen, the floor sloped slightly downward, as if the tunnel led deep into the earth, and in the air was a smell, an odor that had penetrated not only through the nose, but through every pore of the body. It was a mixture of sulfur, decaying flesh, and something else, something indefinable that caused instant nausea. In my profession, I've trained my nose to detect the most subtle aromas in a wine, to appreciate notes of fruit, spices, flowers, earth, and minerals, but that smell was the antithesis of all that. It was absolute corruption, the negation of all sensory pleasure, an insult to all that is beautiful and harmonious. I wasn't alone in that place. I heard moans, screams, and laments coming from all sides, voices pledging for mercy, begging for a sip of water, calling out names that would never be answered. Some voices sounded ancient, as if they'd been wailing for centuries. Others seemed recent, fresh in their despair, and most disturbing of all, I heard laughter, dry, joyless laughter, laden with malice and cruelty, laughter that reveled in the suffering of others, that fed off the pain. It was then that I saw the first figures, shadows moving in the gloom, shapes writhing on the tunnel walls. As my eyes adjusted to that somber light, I began to make out details. They were entities that seemed made of smoke and ash, with eyes that glowed like embers. They moved erratically, sometimes crawling on the ground, sometimes gliding through the air. Some had vaguely humanoid shapes, others resembled distorted animals, and still others defied any classification. One of them approached me. It had no defined face, just a dark mass with two luminous points serving as eyes. It didn't speak, but I sensed its intention. It wanted me to follow it. With no other choice, I obeyed. We walked, or rather, I walked, and it floated through that endless tunnel. As we advanced, the surroundings changed subtly, the tunnel widening even further, and I realized we were entering a cave of unimaginable proportions. The ceiling was now visible, but so distant it seemed like the sky of an inverted world, and on the walls I saw something that chilled my soul. Cells, rows upon rows of cells carved into the volcanic rock. They climbed the walls as far as my eye could see, forming a dizzying pattern of individual prisons. In each of them, people, not people as we know them in the world of the living, but their essences. Their imprisoned souls were naked, exposed, their spectral forms writhing without constant agony. Some screamed, others murmured incoherently, still others remained in terrible silence, glassy eyes gazing at unseen horrors. The angel of God who guided me stopped before one of the cells. Inside it was a man, his spectral body seemingly consumed from within, as if invisible worms were continually devouring him. His skin, or what was left of it, was translucent, revealing decaying organs and blackened bones. He looked at me, and for an instant his eyes focused, recognizing my presence. There was a terrible lucidity in that gaze, a full awareness of his condition and his torment. "You," he said, his voice was hoarse, as if his vocal cords were raw, "are you alive?" "I don't know," I replied, unsure of my own condition. "If you see me, if you're here, but can still get out, then you're alive." He approached the bars of his cell. The movement felt like indescribable pain, but he persisted, dragging himself toward the barrier that separated him from me. "Please, when you return, tell my children, tell them this place is real, that it's not a story made up to scare children. Tell them not to follow in my footsteps." "Who are you?" I asked, trying to understand why he was there. because anyone would be in such a terrible place. I was like you, he replied, a respected man. I worked as a wine curator at Chaggu. Everyone trusted me. I felt a tightness in my chest. It was like looking into a distorted mirror. Chat Margul, one of the most prestigious wine producers in the world. How many times had I served his exceptional vintages, describing the history and tradition of that place to customers, never imagining that I would encounter one of his exfancharias in the depths of hell. What happened? I asked, though I feared the answer. I started small, a bottle here, another there, always with the intention of replenishing. His voice had a confessional tone, as if speaking as much to me as to himself. At first, it was just for personal tastings. I wanted to impress friends, to show off my access to wines most people would never taste, but the wine was so excellent, and so were the temptations. Soon, I began selling a few bottles on the black market, rare bottles to impress friends, expensive gifts to keep me mistress and satisfied, a double life no one suspected. He laughed, a harsh, lifeless sound that seemed to tear at his very being. The worst part wasn't the bottles I stole, it was the hypocrisy. On Sundays, Mass was at the St. Jean Cathedral. He spoke about integrity, about honesty, about the sanctity of trust, and then, on Monday, he falsified the seller's inventory records, replaced exceptional wine labels with inferior ones, and manipulated the reviews so no one would notice what was happening. I felt a chill run down my spine. His words touched something deep inside me, something I'd been burying for years under layers of rationalization and self-justification. How many bottles had I borrowed from the restaurant's cellar? How many times had I manipulated the inventory to cover my tracks? How many lies had I told myself, telling myself it wasn't really theft, just an unstated privilege of my position? How long have you been here, Pugin? Temper. He let out another bitter laugh that echoed through the cave walls like a lament. Here, there's no time as you know it. Every second is eternal. Every minute is a century. I've been here for 1,000 years or a day. It makes no difference. He brought his face closer to the bars, and I could see details I'd rather not have noticed. His eyes contained universes of suffering, memories of torments that transcended human comprehension. Do you know what the worst torment is? He whispered, as if sharing a terrible secret. It's not physical pain, though it is unbearable. It's awareness, absolute clarity. Here there are no illusions, there are no excuses, no rationalizations. You see exactly who you are, what you've done, and all the opportunities you've wasted to do things differently, and this vision is relentless, constant, eternal. The angel of God who guided me began to move again, indicating that we should continue. I looked one last time at the man, wanting to say something, to offer some comfort, but there were no words. Remember, he shouted as he walked away, tell them it's real. We continued on, passing more and more cells, in each one a different story, but with the same tragic ending. I saw a boss who used his position to humiliate subordinates while promoting himself as a mentor. He was now forced to swallow dishes that turned to hot coals as soon as they touched his lips, burning him inside forever. He saw a woman who led a charity ministry in Montpellier but diverted most of the resources to herself. Now she was drowning up to her neck, a liquid that looked like melted money burning like acid on her skin, as she was forced to drink the substance that never quenched her thirst. The angel of God stopped before another cell, larger than the previous ones. Inside it was not just one person, but several, all nurses, all suffering the same endless agony, and at their center, a man whose presence, even in his spectral state, radiated authority. This, said the angel of God, speaking for the first time in a voice that sounded like the scraping of metal against stone. He was a great leader, he built the gastronomic empire, thousands admired him, believing him to be the supreme master of French cuisine. They recognized his face immediately, even in its deteriorated state. Ira-Antoine Beaumont, one of France's most celebrated chefs, who died a few years ago. His dozens of Michelin-starred restaurants, his cookbooks, his TV shows, all of this had made him a legend in the world of gastronomy. I had the honor, at least, or so I thought then, of working with him briefly early in my career. The man looked at me, his eyes burning with a mixture of pride and despair. "I truly believed," he said. "At first, at least, I believed in my art, that food was a form of spiritual elevation, that I was creating experiences that enriched the lives of people who celebrated the best of French tradition." His voice, once commanding and confident, now trembled with a vulnerability he had never shown in life. But then came the fame, the Magellan stars, the money, and the more I had, the more I wanted. My ego grew beyond all limits. I began to believe in my own myth, that I was superior to others, that the rules normal didn't apply to me. He pointed to the people around him, suffering specters writhing in shared agony. These were my most dedicated apprentices, the ones who would give their lives for me, the ones who endured unspeakable abuse because I said it was the price of excellence, the ones who sacrificed everything for my approval. I remembered the stories that circulated about the good kitchens, the screams, the thrown objects, the public humiliations, the 18-hour shifts without a break. At the time, this was seen as part of the folklore of haute cuisine, the price to pay for genius. Now, seeing the end result, it seemed like collective madness. "Why are they here too, Purgandi?" I confided. "If they were deceived, it was because deep down they knew," the man replied, and there was a brutal honesty in his voice that he had never demonstrated in life. "We all know when we are following something wrong. Our conscience screams, but we choose to ignore it. They followed me because it was easier than thinking for themselves, because they wanted to believe there was a simple path to success, a formula that didn't require true integrity." He made a sweeping gesture with his hand, indicating not just those in his cell, but all the hell around us. No one here was fooled. No, really, we all had our chances, our moments of choice. We all heard that little voice inside that said, "This is wrong," and we all chose to ignore it, some out of greed, some out of fear, some out of laziness, but we all chose its words. It resonated with me with a painful truth. How many times had I felt that inner discomfort when siphoning a bottle, when lying to a client about a vintage, when deceiving my wife about where I'd been the night before? And how many times had I muffled that voice, rationalized my actions, convinced myself that what I was doing wasn't really that serious? We continued our journey, descending ever lower. The heat increased with each step, becoming almost unbearable. The cave walls now seemed to pulse with a life of their own, as if the entire place were a gigantic organism. The screams and wails intensified, forming a cacophony of despair that filled every inch of the space. We passed sections specialized in different types of torments. There was an area where people who had given themselves over to lust were locked in embraces that seemed pleasurable from a distance, but up close revealed themselves to be torture, partners with skin that burned like embers, caresses that cut like razors, kisses that suffocated like poison. In another section, I saw people who had been greedy in life, now submerged up to their necks in lakes of molten gold. They desperately tried to drink the precious metal, as if it could quench their insatiable thirst, only to have their throats burned from the inside out. We arrived in a vast circular hall. In the center was a huge pit from which flames so intense they had a bluish hue at the core gushed forth. Around the pit, hooded figures performed some kind of macabre ritual. They chanted in a language I had never heard. But strangely, I understood. They were invoking ancient forces, entities whose names made my soul writhe with fear. The angel of God guiding me made a sweeping gesture with what appeared to be an arm. "Behold," he said in his metallic voice, "this is the heart of hell. From here come the influences that corrupt the world of the living." I looked more closely and saw that not only flames emerged from the pit, but also what appeared to be arrows or spears made of pure negative energy. They spiraled upward, piercing the ceiling of the cavern, aiming for the earth's surface. They were like inverted lightning bolts, shooting from underground toward the sky, each carrying a visible charge of malice. "What are these things?" I asked. "Fiery darts of the evil one." The angel of God replied, "Temptations, influences, whispers that plant seeds of destruction in the minds of the living. Some resist, most succumb." I watched that scene for an indeterminate amount of time, mesmerized by the constant flow of evil energy, The arrows seemed to have specific targets, as if each one were aimed at a particular person in the world of the living. Some were thicker and more powerful, perhaps aimed at people of great influence. Others were more subtle, almost invisible, but no less lethal in their purpose. Each dart carries a specific temptation, my guide explained, as if reading my thoughts. Some incite violence, others to lust, others to lies, others to hopelessness. Each is designed to exploiting his target's particular weakness. Then God's angel touched me. His touch cold as the vacuum of space, and guided me to another section of the cave. This area was different. Instead of individual cells, there was an open space where countless souls wandered aimlessly. They seemed disoriented, confused, as if they had lost something precious and couldn't remember what. There wasn't the explicit torment I'd seen in the other sessions, but something even more disturbing, a lack of purpose so profound it was a form of suffering in itself. These are the indifferent, my guide explained, neither good enough for heaven, nor bad enough for the depths of hell. They went through their lives without doing anything meaningful, without taking a stand, without taking risks, without truly loving. I approached one of these souls, a man from Maidate, whose eyes seemed lost in infinity. His face held an expression of mild surprise, as if he still hadn't fully grasped where he was or how he'd gotten there. "Who are you, HCK?" He looked at me, but his gaze seemed to pierce me, focused on some distant point only he could see. "I don't remember anymore. I know I've had a burgundy life, I know I've had opportunities, but I never did anything with them. I always waited for the perfect moment that never arrived. I always postponed important decisions until tomorrow, which I now realize never existed." His voice was monotonous, without the intense emotion that had characterized the other condemned men. It was as if even his suffering was mild, insipid. "I wasn't a bad man," he continued. "I never stole, never killed, never caused intentional harm, but I also never did the good I could have. I never defended the weak, never opposed injustice, never loved with abandon. I lived a life of lukewarm commitments, of comfortable mediocrity, of horizons limited by my own cowardice." I felt a deep sadness for him and all the others like him. Somehow, his fate seemed even more tragic than that of those in the cells. At least these had lived fully, even if on the wrong path. The indifferent ones had not even that. My guide led me even deeper into the cave. The air was now so dense it seemed liquid. Every movement required tremendous effort, and the heat was indescribable, like being in the center of a bakery oven, but with no possibility of escape. We reached an area where the floor was covered with wine bottles, millions, billions of bottles of the rarest and the most precious wines, forming mountains that stretched as far as the eye could see. Bordeaux Premier Cru, Roman Ectanti, Petrus, Chateauguay, legendary vintages that cost thousands of euros per bottle. Among these mountains, human figures shuffled about, frantically gathering bottles for candles only, emptying them into their hands, the precious liquid evaporating before they could taste it. "The misers," said my guide, "those who loved sensual pleasure and status more than they loved God or their neighbor. Here they could touch their object of desire eternally, but never be satisfied." I noticed one man in particular, best Atras Elegant or what was left of them, for he was in rags. He had an air of distinction, even in his spectral state. He grabbed bottles with desperate greed, opening them frantically, only to see them dry out before he could taste a drop. The frustration on his face was palpable, a specific and refined agony, like the wines he could never taste. He noticed my presence and came toward me, dragging himself over the pile of empty bottles. His movements were precise. Despite his torment, like someone who had spent his life cultivating an elegance that now only served to accentuate misery. "You're new here," he said. His voice was shaky, but still carried a trace of authority. "You still don't understand how it works. You need to accumulate as much as you can. It's the only way to survive." "But the bottles are empty," I replied. "You can't drink from them. It's a matter of technique," he insisted, feverish. "If you're fast enough, smart enough. I was the director of Guide Michelin, you know. I tasted the finest wines in the finest restaurants, knew all the important producers, all the exceptional vintages. I could tell the difference between a Montrachet and the Corton Charlemagne blindfolded. It's no different here. I just need to discover the correct method. His eyes held a glint of madness, but also a grim determination. It was as if, even in hell, he refused to accept that there were certain things beyond his control, certain pleasures he would never experience again. He returned to his frantic task, ignoring me completely. I glanced at my guide, who gestured for us to continue. As we walked away, I noticed something disturbing. Among the empty bottles, occasionally, there would be one that still contained a few drops of wine. When this happened, the damned fought savagely among themselves for the privilege of tasting those precious drops. I saw men and women who had likely been refined and civilized in transforming life into bestial creatures, tearing each other apart for a fleeting moment of pleasure that only intensified their subsequent torment. We continued on to another session. The path now descended steeply, as if we were heading toward the Earth's core. With each step, the environment became more oppressive, more hostile to life. The rock beneath our feet was so hot I could feel my skin, or whatever it was, being served. As my skin in that spirit form began to burn, I regenerated in a continuous cycle of pain. We passed a chamber where people were being forced to swallow molten metal. I saw another where the condemned were repeatedly drowned in a liquid that resembled wine but clearly caused indescribable agony. The punishment seemed meticulously tailored to the sins committed in life. Finally, we reached a circular chamber, smaller than the previous ones, but somehow more terrifying. The ambience here was different, almost elegant, with an atmosphere reminiscent of the grand restaurants where I had worked. In the center was a long table, like those used for fine wine tastings. Seated around it were 12 figures, all dressed in impeccable sommelier attire. Their features were indistinct, as if they were constantly shifting, dissolving, and reforming. At the head of the table, a larger figure loomed large. It wasn't human, not even remotely. It was a presence, a manifestation of pure malice. When it spoke, it was not with words, but with impressions formed directly in the mind. "Welcome to our council," said the presence. The voice, if it could be called that, was soft, almost seductive, but with an undertone of infinite cruelty. "You must be wondering what we do here." I couldn't answer. My voice seemed to have been sucked by some invisible force. It was like being in front of a summel so intimidating that it left me speechless to describe the wine I had just tasted. "We plan," the presence continued, we seek more efficient ways to corrupt, to divert, to destroy. Some call it temptation, but it is far more sophisticated than that. It is spiritual engineering." One of the figures seated at the table, for all but a frightening moment, seemed to have my own face. It spoke in a voice that was at once familiar and alien. It was like listening to a distorted recording of myself, the inflections and timbre recognizable, but altered in a way that caused discomfort. "Prestige is our most effective tool," he said, "not prestige itself, but the love of prestige, the obsession with it, the willingness to sacrifice principles, relationships, even one's own soul for recognition." The man wearing my face swirled a wineglass that seemed to contain blood. "It's so subtle that most don't even realize they're being consumed inside. I'm Milius as our visitor here," and in that moment, all eyes at the table turned to me. They are particularly vulnerable. They build their identities around the ability to discern nuances most people don't even notice, to have access to experiences most never have, to be admitted to an exclusive world of specialized knowledge and refined pleasure. He took a sip from the glass, and the liquid ran down the corner of his mouth like an open wound, and then, little by little, they begin to feel that they deserve more than they receive, that their exceptional talent should be exceptionally rewarded, that small liberties with the inventory are merely an unofficial recognition of their worth, and so, bottle by bottle, lie by lie, they surrender themselves to us. Another figure, alongside the first, he added, "Religious hypocrisy is another excellent tactic, making people profess one faith but live another reality. The damage this causes not only to their own souls, but to those of everyone around them, is incalculable. How many have turned away from God because they saw the falseness of those who were supposed to represent him? This one's voice was less familiar, but no less disturbing. It had a clerical tone like that of a priest or pastor, but distorted by an underlying cruelty that no true man of God would possess. They go to Mass on Sundays, confess regularly, perhaps even serve on parish committees, and then, during the week, they steal, lie, and betray. And the most beautiful thing here, her voice took on an almost reverent tone, is that they convince themselves that God understands, that he makes exceptions, that their situation is special. A third figure has manifested itself, and we must not forget the power of indifference, doing nothing when something should be done, not speaking when something should be spoken, not defending when something should be defended is the sin of omission and is responsible for as much suffering as the sins of commission. This voice was softer, almost a whisper, but penetrated deeper for that very reason. How easy it is for them to convince themselves that they are not responsible. I didn't do the wrong, they say, I just didn't interfere, as if inaction wasn't itself a choice. And often the most cowardly of them, the presence at the head of the table, seemed pleased with the contributions. There was an almost paternal quality to his posture, like a proud mentor to his particularly brilliant students. As you can see, he said, addressing me, we operate in a very organized manner. Nothing is left to chance. Every attempt, every evil suggestion, every opportunity for evil is carefully planned and executed. We have departments, teams, specialists. We have performance goals, progress reviews, 5-year strategic plans. There was a perverse pride in his voice, a pleasure in the efficiency of his system of corruption. You could say we're like a multinational corporation, but our product is sin and our market is the human soul. A feeling of nausea swept over me, not only from the horror of what I was witnessing, but from the recognition of how many times I myself had given into these tactics, how many times I had been a pawn in this terrible game. Every bottle I'd embezzled, every inventory I'd falsified, every customer I'd deceived, all of it had been part of a larger plan, a meticulous strategy of corruption that I'd inadvertently served. Why am I seeing this? I finally managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. Why do you still have a choice? Presence answered. There was something unexpected in his voice now, not exactly kindness, but a kind of grudging respect. Unlike the others you've encountered here, your sentence hasn't yet been sealed. You're visiting a rare, but not unprecedented, circumstance. Some call it a death experience, though it's much more than that. The Presence made a sweeping gesture, encompassing the entire room. This is a warning, a chance to reconsider your path, to do things differently when you return. If I return, I murmured. You will return, the Presence assured. There was a certainty in its voice that was both comforting and threatening. It's decided. The question is, what will you do with this experience? Will you return to your old habits, to your moral comfort zone, or will you make a genuine change? Before I could respond, I felt a force pulling me upward. It was as if an invisible cord was attached to my being and someone was quickly retrieving it. Your time here is over for now, the Presence said. The emphasis on the last sentence was subtle, but unmistakable. We will meet again under more permanent circumstances, unless you choose another path. The last thing I saw was the smile of the Presence, not a human smile, but a distortion in reality itself that communicated cruel amusement. And then I was ascending, passing through layers upon layers of rock and darkness, passing through all the sections of hell at breakneck speed. I saw the tormented souls like flashes of light in my ascent. I heard their screams blending into a symphony of despair that diminished as I moved away. It was like tasting wine in reverse. Instead of perceiving increasing layers of complexity, I felt the notes of suffering gradually dissipating, replaced by a growing clarity. I emerged into a tunnel of intense light, so bright after the darkness of hell that it momentarily blinded me. The stifling heat gave way to a pleasantly cool sensation, like diving into the waters of the Mediterranean after a day under the Provençal sun. It was like tasting a cold Sancerre after an excessively alcoholic Chateauneuf from Papi, a complete shift in sensation and perspective. I felt floor.